One of my friends told me this story back in high school. It was around 2016. This took place when he was maybe about 15 years old. At the sake of this story, I'm going to call him by the name Ivan. Ivan at the time was in sophomore year, and at this time he wanted to do something really special with a group of his friends. He invited a few of his friends that he knew since kindergarten to go on Halloween trick-or-treating with him. They agreed, and they started going on their way and started did pretty much going to door, wishing everyone trick or treat and get candy. As Ivan and his friends were getting lots of candy, they ended up coming across what seemed to be an old, suspicious looking car. Now, this was actually really, really concerning, as this car was standing about maybe a few feet away, and not to mention that it was near some grass area, which happens to be a field not far from the house. Obviously, this was really concerning, and that's when Ivan asked his friends if they should run or they should go to the police. They weren't sure as to what they were going to do, so they looked and see if there was someone in the car, but there was no one there. All of a sudden, they looked to see the driver, who happened to be maybe in his late 40s, and he was looking at Ivan and his friends. "Hey, I got some candy if you want to come in," he said. Now, Ivan was really scared at this point, knowing what this guy was planning on doing. They end up saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I have to be home. It's a school night the next day. I'll see you later." Ivan said that as he and his friends walked away. Obviously, this car started to slowly follow them, and that's when they ended up starting to run. As they were running with their candy bags and costumes, they ended up going down to a few more streets just to hope they would lose the guy. By the time they reached Ivan's house, his mom and dad were standing outside, and as they got there to the house, the vehicle stopped right in front of the driveway. Ivan's dad ended up shouting at them, at whoever was in the car, to get out or he's calling the police. Of course, when the police sirens arrived, the car was gone, but there was no trace as to where that car went. It was really something, knowing whoever this guy was trying to pretty much kidnap Ivan and his friends or do God knows what. On Halloween night can be a really scary night, so you gotta be really careful of suspicious vehicles, even if you're trick-or-treating alone. About over 10 years ago, this actually happened to one of my teachers at the time of this story. I'm gonna call her by the name Bonnie for the sake of the story. Now, Bonnie was handing out candy pretty much on every Halloween, as all of her children have grown up and they moved out. Bonnie, of course, was living alone, but she was used to being by herself. Ever since her husband and her got a divorce, she had been hosting everything all by herself, and she rarely sees him. At the time of this story, she was in her early 50s. Now, as she was pretty much watching a Halloween movie, she was handing out candy to lots of people. She had seen a lot of costumes, and most of them were pretty good. However, something weird started happening when she looked out and saw there was an older man. This man looked to be in his 20s, and at first she thought that this guy was too old for trick-or-treating, but decided not to bother with that and opened the door. "Trick or treat," he said. He apparently was dressed up as the ghost face from Scream. As Bonnie handed him the candy, she ended up asking him on if he was too old to trick or treat, and he said, "Oh no, I'm just doing this for my son. He's sick." As he said that, Bonnie felt sympathy for him and lets him be on his way. It wasn't until maybe around just before midnight, when Halloween started to die down. People stopped answering their doors at the time, and this is when things started getting really freaky. Bonnie was asleep on her couch when she woke up to hearing loud bangs coming from the front door. As she got up and she looked inside, she could see that there was this man. It was the same one in the Ghostface scream with a knife. He started screaming and begging her to open the door and let him in. As he continues to do this, that's when Bonnie ends up getting really freaked out. She ended up telling him to go away or that she would call the police. She ends up grabbing her cell phone and ran upstairs and hid herself in the bathroom, where she locked the door and started to call 911. As she was on the phone with the operator, she was pretty much scared as this guy was pretty big and he was trying to break in the house. Of course, she stayed on the phone with the 911 operator and what felt like maybe a few minutes or so. Until then, suddenly, she heard what seemed to be glass shattering. It turns out this guy had somehow found a way into the house by breaking a mirror or a window. As she was on the phone, she ended up pleading to the 911 operator to just please send the police. And of course, she stayed in that room for what felt like forever until she heard the sound of sirens in the distance. As she was hearing sirens in the distance, she was really glad that whoever it was apparently ran off. Of course, this man didn't get far as he tried to attempt to break in somebody else's house, but of course, the police had caught him. As they caught him, that's when the 911 operators said that Bonnie can go out and investigate now that it was quiet. As she went inside, outside of the bathroom, she ended up looking to see that there was a few police officers with a man in handcuffs. Obviously, this man looked to be on drugs. They asked her if she knew this man, and she said she didn't know who he was. Eventually, this man was taken into the police car, where he was taken to the police station to be dealt with. Every Halloween now, Bonnie is very careful on who she opens the door to, and especially on Halloween, because you never know who could be out there. What's really shocking enough is that Bonnie has been putting door alarms and even a camera outside of her house. She gets paranoid every Halloween, thinking that same guy would come back for her. Nothing has happened since, and she hopes it stays that way. So this happened sometime maybe in 2021 when the global pandemic started to die down slowly, and that was during 1 year when trick-or-treating was still possible. At the time of this story, I'm just going to say that one of my friends who told me this, we'll call her by the name Vanessa. Vanessa was spending Halloween with her boyfriend at the time of the story. And of course, while she was spending time with her boyfriend, his parents had gone out for the night and left him to watch the house. They mainly do overnight shifts, so they were obviously pretty much out on the run and sleep in the morning. Vanessa and her boyfriend decided they would spend some time on Halloween night dressed up, and they pretty much hand out candy to some trick-or-treaters. As they were handing out candy, they ended up looking over to see that there was someone across the street from them. At first, they thought that maybe it could have been the dad of one of the parents, but of course he didn't look like it as he was wearing all black. This confuses Vanessa and her boyfriend, but they were also getting a little worried about what this guy was doing. Of course, after the trick-or-treaters and Halloween died down, Vanessa went outside to smoke when she all of a sudden looked out through the window. She can see that there was a man wearing a hoodie and was wearing cargo pants, and he was standing about maybe 10 feet away from the back porch. Obviously, she wasn't sure as to how he got there, but she looks to see that it could have been the same guy that was at the other side of the driveway just not that long ago. Vanessa started to get a little anxious at this point, so she ended up calling her boyfriend over and telling him the situation. Her boyfriend looked out, and saw him, but of course they started again a little weirded out by him. He ended up opening his window and asking the guy to please leave the property. Of course he didn't seem to be doing anything since he was still standing there. He didn't even acknowledge them, to which was surprising. He stared at them for quite a while until this is when Vanessa's boyfriend decided to go get the police. As he called on the phone, that's when Vanessa ended up shouting to him to get out and that the police are on their way. She made sure that the door was locked just to be on the safe side, just to avoid this guy from trying to attempt to break in or do God knows what. As they were on the phone and the police arrived, the man was gone and there was no trace of him left anywhere. What's really shocking is how did he get escaped by the time the police arrived? Of course, the police said they would patrol the area at night just to make sure that nothing happens, and so far nothing like this has ever happened again. This is why Vanessa and her boyfriend get paranoid on Halloween. Not knowing who or what could be out there on Halloween. They weren't sure if that guy was posing a trick or something much worse. This really still frightens them to this day, and they still think about this Halloween night every now and then. But ever since then, they never seen that guy again, and they wondered if he's gone to prison or getting the help that he needs. It really makes them wonder. Now, was about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. This actually happened to one of the teachers that used to be at my high school before I moved. Obviously, I've heard about this from a couple of students who went to this school, and this was before the global pandemic started. At the time of this story, I'm going to call the victim's name by the name Carol. Carol was maybe in her early 50s, and she loved Halloween. She used to take her kids out trick-or-treating, but since all of her kids have pretty much moved on to college and stuff, they were rarely home, and she was all by herself. Ever since her husband died about 2 years before this event, she always loved Halloween, and she always really enjoyed Halloween so much. Of course, it was Halloween around the time when trick-or-treaters were coming, when all of a sudden she ended up hearing what seemed like wood creaking coming from the other side of her house. At first she thought that it could have been one of her dogs walking, but as she walked over, the creaking stopped. Confused as to why the creaking was going on, she ends up going over there to investigate, only to hear the trick-or-treaters at the door. As she handed out candy, she ended up going back there just to check to make sure there was no one attempting to break in. As Carol looked, she ended up hearing creaking again. This time it came from upstairs. She goes upstairs to have a look and checks every room to make sure there was no one attempt to break in or anything like that. She didn't find anyone in there, thankfully, so she looked around and called out if anyone was there, but there was no one there. Just then she heard one of her dogs barking aggressively coming from downstairs. She ends up going downstairs to the basement and opening the door, but to find absolutely no one. She ends up checking down the basement, but she couldn't find anything as to who or what it was that was downstairs. She searched everywhere, but she couldn't find the source of it, and she wonders if this was all paranormal or just her imagination. Every Halloween and every now and then she hears these creaking noises, and she always thinks that there could be someone in the house, but there literally wasn't. What was to become of this was obviously a questionable thing. Still to this day, Carol is very, very, very pretty much paranoid of this house, and she thinks that her house might be haunted. I think what had happened through that day was completely paranormal.